The flight attendant's smug smile vanished as Zoe pulled out her federal credentials. Passengers gasped. The woman who had humiliated her minutes ago now stammered apologies. But Zoe wasn't finished. This discrimination would cost the airline millions by tomorrow morning. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories about people standing up against discrimination. Now, let's find out how this flight attendant's day went from bad to career-ending. Zoe Washington pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the airport terminal window, watching planes taxi across the tarmac through exhausted eyes. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought for everything she had. Her dark brown fingers tapped absently against her phone as she waited for her flight to board, scrolling through emails that never seemed to end. Flight 1372 to Washington, D.C. will begin boarding in 15 minutes, announced a cheerful voice over the intercom, barely audible above the hum of the crowded Chicago O'Hare terminal. Zoe sighed, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. Her natural hair framed her face in tight coils, professional yet unapologetically hers. She wore dark jeans and a simple blouse under a lightweight blazer, comfortable for travel but professional enough for someone of her position. Not that anyone would guess she was a senior investigator for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division just by looking at her. She had spent the past week in Chicago finalizing an important housing discrimination case. The victory had been significant, but draining. All she wanted now was to get home, take a long shower, and sleep in her own bed. The red-eye flight wasn't ideal, but as a government employee, she believed in fiscal responsibility. Economy class was perfectly fine, despite her colleagues often upgrading themselves on similar trips. As Zoe gathered her belongings and headed toward the gate, her mind drifted back to the moment that had set her on this path. She was only 10 years old, watching helplessly as police officers handcuffed her father outside their home in Baltimore. A neighbor had reported a suspicious man in the area. That suspicious man was her father, a respected math teacher, returning from an evening jog. "I'm going to fix this," she had promised him through tears after his release 6 terrifying hours later. Through the law, Zoe, her father had told her, his wrists still marked from the handcuffs. Not through anger. Change comes from within the system. Those words had guided her through Howard University and then Harvard Law School, through clerkships and finally to the DOJ. While others posted outrage on social media, Zoe worked methodically within the system to hold it accountable. The gate agent announced boarding, and Zoe joined the crowded line. The flight was overbooked, typical for the last connection of the day. Passengers jostled for position, clutching carry-ons and personal items with the desperate energy of travelers fearing overhead bin shortages. As the line inched forward, Zoe observed the interactions between airline staff and passengers. The subtle differences were apparent to her trained eye, the warmer smiles for some, the cursory glances for others. White passengers received patient explanations about seat assignments and overhead space, while passengers of color received clipped instructions and scrutiny of their carry-ons. This wasn't her first time noticing such discrepancies. As someone who traveled frequently for work, patterns emerged across airlines and airports. Usually, she filed it away as mental data, another piece of evidence in the larger puzzle of American discrimination. Tonight, however, she was too tired to analyze. She just wanted to get home. Zoe handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, a young white woman who barely glanced at her before waving her through. Just another subtle reminder of differential treatment. Zoe took a deep breath and boarded the aircraft, unaware that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The narrow aisle of the Boeing 737 was already clogged with passengers struggling to find space for their belongings. Zoe squeezed past a family with small children, offering a tired smile as she made her way to seat 23C. Middle seat. Of course. On either side of her assigned seat sat 2 white businessmen, both already comfortably settled with their items stowed. The one by the window, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair, glanced up briefly as she approached. The aisle passenger, younger with neatly trimmed brown hair and kind eyes, stood immediately to let her in. "Thanks," Zoe said, sliding into her seat. "No problem," the younger man replied. "Timothy Reed." He offered his hand. "Zoe Washington," she responded, shaking it briefly before settling in. As more passengers boarded, the overhead bins quickly filled. Zoe had brought only one regulation-sized carry-on suitcase and her laptop bag, but was struggling to find space nearby. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, helping some passengers rearrange items to accommodate more bags. The head flight attendant, a blonde woman whose name tag read Heather Bennett, efficiently assisted several white passengers in the rows ahead, showing them where to stow their oversized bags and offering to put some items in the first-class closet. When Zoe raised her hand to ask for similar assistance, Heather's eyes slid past her, focusing instead on an older white couple several rows back. It was subtle, so subtle that most might not notice. But Zoe noticed. She always noticed. She tried again, making direct eye contact this time, but Heather turned away, busying herself with checking seatbelts in another section. The dismissal was clear, if deniable. Timothy, the passenger beside her, raised an eyebrow. "Did you need help with your bag?" "I was hoping to find space for it nearby," Zoe explained, gesturing to her small suitcase still sitting awkwardly in the aisle. "The bins back here seem full." "Let me try to flag someone down," Timothy offered, but the flight attendants continued to hurry past, seemingly oblivious to their section. As the cabin crew announced final preparations for departure, Zoe realized she was out of options. She pressed the call button above her seat, a last attempt to get assistance before being forced to check her bag containing important case files. The light flashed, a small act of resistance against invisibility. The call button above Zoe's seat continued to flash, its silent plea for attention ignored as flight attendants rushed past. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Passengers were settling in, the boarding process nearly complete, yet still no one responded to her call. Heather Bennett, the head flight attendant, moved efficiently through the cabin, checking overhead bins and seat backs. She paused to help an elderly white woman stow her purse just 2 rows ahead, smiling warmly. "Excuse me," Zoe called out as Heather turned to walk away. "I pressed my call button some time ago. I need assistance with my bag." Heather glanced at Zoe, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "I'll be with you shortly," she replied, but continued down the aisle in the opposite direction. Zoe watched as Heather helped 3 more passengers, all white, with similar requests. One man's bag was nearly identical to Zoe's, yet Heather cheerfully found space for it in a forward compartment. Timothy Reed, the passenger beside Zoe, shifted uncomfortably. He'd been observing the situation unfold with growing discomfort. "That's not right," he murmured, making eye contact with Zoe. Zoe appreciated the acknowledgement but remained focused on the issue at hand. She pressed the call button again, more determined this time. Moments later, Heather appeared at their row, reaching up without a word to switch off the call light. "Excuse me," Zoe said firmly. "I need assistance with my bag. I've been waiting for over 15 minutes. Heather's expression hardened. "The overhead bins are full. You'll need to check your bag." "There seems to be space in the forward compartments," Zoe replied calmly. "You've helped several other passengers find room for their bags, some larger than mine." "Those passengers called for assistance earlier," Heather countered, though Zoe had been watching her ignore the call button for a quarter hour. "I've had my call button on for quite some time," Zoe stated, maintaining her composure despite her rising frustration. "And I've tried to get your attention directly several times." Heather's posture stiffened. "Are you suggesting something?" "I'm simply asking for the same assistance you've provided to other passengers." By now, several nearby travelers had turned to watch the exchange. A young woman across the aisle had discreetly taken out her phone and appeared to be recording. "I think you're being difficult," Heather said, her voice carrying through the nearby rows. You should have checked your larger items if you were concerned about space. My bag is regulation size, Zoe responded. And I've observed you helping other passengers with similar or larger bags find space in forward compartments. Timothy cleared his throat. She's right. I've been watching too. Her bag is smaller than the one you just helped with a few rows up. Heather shot him a sharp look before turning back to Zoe. If you have a complaint, you can file it with customer service after we land. Right now, you need to check your bag or find space for it yourself. You're disrupting the boarding process. More phones had emerged, recording the interaction. Zoe remained calm, her years of legal training evident in her measured response. I'm not trying to disrupt anything. I'm simply requesting equal treatment. Equal treatment? Heather's voice rose slightly. Is that what this is about? The implication hung in the air between them. Yes, Zoe replied simply. Equal treatment. Heather's eyes narrowed. I'll have to speak with the captain about this. Your behavior is becoming problematic. What behavior would that be? Zoe asked. Requesting assistance. Without answering, Heather turned sharply and moved toward the front of the aircraft. Other crew members had noticed the confrontation and were now gathering nearby, exchanging glances. A flight attendant named Carlos approached cautiously. Is there a problem here? I need assistance storing my carry-on, Zoe explained. I've been trying to get help for some time. Carlos looked uncertain, glancing toward where Heather had disappeared. Let me see what I can do, he offered, but before he could help, Heather returned with a determined stride. The captain has been informed of a situation, she announced loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear. If it continues, we'll need to take further action. The threat was clear, and Zoe recognized the escalation tactic. She'd seen it before, how quickly a reasonable request from a person of color could be characterized as aggression, how swiftly assistance could transform into security. Throughout the cabin, reactions varied. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Others watched with open curiosity or concern. A few nodded in agreement with Heather, eager for the problem to be removed so the flight could depart. Timothy Reed sat straighter in his seat. This is ridiculous, he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. She just needs help with her bag, like everyone else. Heather ignored him, keeping her gaze fixed challengingly on Zoe. Well? Are we going to have an issue? Zoe took a measured breath. This moment felt familiar, the crossroads where she could either accept the unfair treatment or challenge it and risk escalation. As a DOJ investigator, she'd counseled countless individuals through similar moments. Now she was living one. There's no issue, Zoe replied calmly. I'm simply a passenger requesting the same assistance others have received. If you'd prefer, I can speak with your supervisor about this apparent policy of selective assistance. Heather's cheeks flushed. I'll be right back, she said tersely, turning on her heel. As Heather walked away, Zoe noticed something she hadn't before. Another black passenger a few rows ahead was receiving similar treatment from a different flight attendant, subtle dismissals, cursory responses, the slight but unmistakable difference in tone. The pattern was emerging, and Zoe's professional instincts kicked in. This wasn't just about her bag anymore. The tension in the cabin thickened as Heather returned, this time accompanied by the captain and a uniformed security officer. Heads turned as the trio made their way down the narrow aisle toward Zoe's seat. Some passengers whispered to each other, while others openly recorded the unfolding drama on their phones. Ma'am, the captain addressed Zoe, his voice carrying authority designed to intimidate. I understand there's a situation that's delaying our departure. Before Zoe could respond, Heather jumped in. This passenger is being disruptive and confrontational. She's refused to comply with crew member instructions regarding her luggage. Zoe maintained her composure. That's not accurate, Captain. I simply requested the same assistance with my carry-on that was provided to other passengers. Ms. Bennett has repeatedly ignored my requests and is now mischaracterizing my behavior. The security officer, whose name badge read Brad Carter, shifted uncomfortably, seeming unsure of his role in this situation. "She's playing the race card," Heather announced loudly, causing several passengers to gasp. "I treat all passengers exactly the same." The accusation hung in the air, its deliberate volume ensuring maximum humiliation. This was no longer about a bag, it was a public spectacle designed to discredit and shame. The moment triggered a flood of memories for Zoe, being followed in stores as a teenager, professors expressing surprise at her articulate arguments in law school, potential clients requesting to speak with the real lawyer when she entered conference rooms. Each instance had taught her to remain calm, to document, to strategize. Never to show the anger that would only reinforce stereotypes. "Have you been recording this?" An older white woman demanded from across the aisle, pointing at a young man with his phone out. "That's an invasion of privacy." "Actually, ma'am," the young man replied, "there's no expectation of privacy in public spaces like an airplane cabin." The cabin was dividing, passengers taking sides in a conflict that should never have escalated to this point. "I've been watching this whole thing," Timothy Reed stood up beside Zoe. "This woman has been nothing but polite while asking for the same help others received. I'm an executive who flies weekly, and I've never seen such blatant differential treatment." Heather's face hardened. "Sir, please sit down. If you continue to interfere, we can arrange for you to be removed as well." Timothy remained standing. "Are you threatening me for speaking up about what I've witnessed? Have you ever witnessed discrimination firsthand?" Comment number 1 if you would have spoken up like Timothy, or number 2 if you would have stayed silent. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see how this confrontation escalates. "Sir, please take your seat," the captain instructed firmly. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Timothy replied, but slowly sat down, his expression troubled. The security officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. We can resolve this issue off the aircraft." Zoe recognized the tactic immediately. Once removed from the flight, passengers rarely returned. Their seats were filled, the plane departed, and the airline could handle the misunderstanding through customer service channels designed to minimize liability rather than address discrimination. "Officer Carter," Zoe addressed him directly, noting his discomfort. "Before we proceed, I'd like to understand exactly what policy I've violated by requesting assistance with my bag." Carter glanced at Heather, then the captain. "I'm just here to ensure the safety of all passengers." "And I appreciate that," Zoe replied. "But safety isn't the issue here. Treatment is." She turned her attention to the growing audience. "Has anyone else noticed differential treatment from the cabin crew today? Perhaps being overlooked or receiving less assistance?" An older black man near the front raised his hand hesitantly. A Latina woman with 2 children nodded. A South Asian businessman several rows back called out, "They questioned my first-class ticket 3 times." Heather's face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. You're creating a scene and turning passengers against our crew." "I'm simply asking questions," Zoe replied calmly. "If there's no pattern of differential treatment, there should be no issue with my inquiry." The captain stepped forward. "That's enough. Ms. Washington, please gather your belongings. You'll need to deplane immediately." As Zoe stood, she noticed at least 6 passengers recording the interaction. Good. Documentation would be crucial. "Very well, Captain," Zoe agreed, reaching for her bag. "I'll need your full name and employee number for my report, as well as those of Ms. Bennett and Officer Carter." "Report?" Heather scoffed. "To customer service? Good luck with that." Zoe smiled slightly. "Not quite." She reached into her laptop bag, retrieving a small leather wallet. With deliberate slowness, she opened it to reveal a gold badge and identification card bearing the Department of Justice seal. My report will be going directly to the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, Zoe stated clearly, where I serve as a senior investigator specializing in transportation discrimination cases. The stunned silence that followed was deafening. Have you ever seen someone completely misjudge a situation? Comment number 1 if you think Heather should be fired immediately, or number 2 if you believe she deserves a chance to explain herself. What do you think happens next in this power shift? Like and subscribe to find out. The badge in Zoe's hand seemed to glow under the cabin lights, commanding attention from everyone in view. The Department of Justice credentials, with their official gold emblem, transformed the entire dynamic in an instant. Department of Justice? Heather stammered, her confident demeanor crumbling. The captain's authoritative stance faltered as he leaned forward to examine Zoe's identification more closely. Officer Brad Carter took a physical step backward, his hand dropping from his belt. Senior Investigator Zoe Washington, Civil Rights Division, Transportation Section, Zoe confirmed, her voice steady and professional. I've been documenting a pattern of discriminatory treatment since boarding began. A wave of murmurs swept through the cabin. Some passengers gasped. Others clapped. Many continued recording, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. I don't understand, the captain said, his tone shifting from commanding to cautious. You're with the federal government? Yes, Captain, Zoe replied. My division has received multiple complaints about discriminatory treatment on this airline over the past 6 months. Enough that we opened a formal investigation. She turned to address Heather directly. Today's flight was selected for observation based on statistical analysis of previous complaint patterns. I was assigned as an undercover passenger to document first-hand experiences. Heather's face had lost all color. This was a setup. Not at all, Zoe corrected her. This was an investigation based on probable cause. My treatment today simply confirms the pattern we've been tracking. Timothy Reed let out a low whistle from his seat. Talk about karma. The security officer cleared his throat. Ms. Washington, I want to be clear that I was just responding to a crew request. I wasn't aware of the nature of the situation. I understand, Officer Carter, Zoe nodded. Your response will be noted in my report, including your apparent discomfort with how this situation was being handled. The captain's demeanor had transformed entirely. Ms. Washington, perhaps we can discuss this privately. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. This isn't a misunderstanding, Captain, Zoe replied firmly. It's a documented pattern of behavior. And no, we won't be discussing it privately. Discrimination thrives in privacy. Accountability requires transparency. She gestured to her still unresolved luggage situation. I'll need my carry-on properly stowed, as per your airline's policy for regulation-sized bags, and then we can address next steps. Carlos, the flight attendant who had attempted to help earlier, quickly stepped forward. I'll take care of that right away, he said, lifting her bag with exaggerated care and finding space in a forward compartment that had mysteriously become available. Passengers throughout the cabin were reacting to the revelation in various ways. Some appeared vindicated, having perhaps experienced similar treatment themselves. Others looked uncomfortable, confronted with discrimination they might normally have overlooked or denied. A few seemed annoyed at the delay, regardless of the cause. I knew something wasn't right, called out the older black man who had raised his hand earlier. Been flying this airline for 20 years and always get the same treatment. About time somebody did something. Heather attempted to regain control of the situation. This is all a misunderstanding. I treat all passengers equally. The evidence suggests otherwise, Zoe responded calmly. Not just from today, but from dozens of documented complaints and now direct federal observation. The captain rubbed his forehead, clearly calculating the regulatory and public relations disaster unfolding on his aircraft. What happens now? Now, Zoe said, I'll need to interview witnesses and collect statements before we depart. But we're already behind schedule, the captain protested. Yes, Zoe agreed. A delay caused by discriminatory treatment from your staff, not by my investigation. She turned to address the cabin. For any passengers willing to share their observations of today's events or previous experiences on this airline, I'll be taking statements once we're airborne. Your input is valuable and protected under federal whistleblower statutes. Heather's professional mask finally cracked completely. You can't do this. You can't just come onto our flight and accuse us of discrimination based on one interaction. Ms. Bennett, Zoe replied, her tone measured but firm, this isn't about one interaction. It's about a pattern established through multiple complaints, statistical analysis, and now direct observation by a federal investigator. Your treatment of me today was merely the latest data point in an ongoing investigation. A commotion at the front of the aircraft drew everyone's attention. A man in a suit was rushing down the aisle, his airline executive credentials swinging from his neck. I'm Calvin Porter, Regional Director of Operations, he announced breathlessly. Captain, what's the situation here? Before the captain could respond, Zoe stepped forward. Mr. Porter, I'm Senior Investigator Washington with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. I've been documenting discriminatory treatment on this flight as part of an ongoing federal investigation. Porter's expression cycled rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and alarm. I wasn't aware of any federal investigation. That's generally the point of undercover operations, Mr. Porter, Zoe replied. I'd be happy to provide you with the case number and my supervisor's contact information. The regional director cleared his throat. Perhaps we should deplane and discuss this matter in private. That won't be necessary, Zoe stated firmly. I'll be completing my journey as planned, continuing my observation and gathering witness statements. Unless you're suggesting interfering with a federal investigation. Porter's face paled. No, of course not. We fully cooperate with all federal agencies. Excellent, Zoe nodded. Then I suggest we allow this flight to depart without further delay. Ms. Bennett, however, should be removed from this flight pending review. Removed? Heather's voice rose. You can't just have me removed from my job. I'm not removing you from your job, Ms. Bennett, Zoe clarified. I'm recommending you be removed from this specific flight while my investigation continues. Your employer will determine any employment consequences based on their policies regarding discriminatory behavior. Porter nodded quickly. Heather, please gather your things. Barbara will take your position for this flight. As reality set in, Heather's defiance crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the severity of the situation. This will ruin my career, she whispered. Discrimination ruins lives, Ms. Bennett, Zoe replied quietly. Careers can be rebuilt with proper training and changed behavior. As Heather was escorted off the plane, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Tension remained, but there was also a palpable sense of justice being served, of a wrong being righted in real time. Timothy Reed leaned toward Zoe. That was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. It shouldn't take a federal badge to get equal treatment, Zoe replied. But sometimes, that's what it takes to create change. The captain returned to the cockpit, Porter retreated to handle damage control, and the remaining flight attendants moved through the cabin with newfound attentiveness to all passengers, regardless of race. As the plane finally began to taxi, Zoe settled back in her seat, opening her laptop to begin her official report. The investigation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The aircraft remained at the gate 30 minutes past its scheduled departure time, the jetways still connected as airline officials scrambled to address the situation. In the main cabin, the atmosphere had transformed dramatically. Flight attendants who had previously overlooked certain passengers now offered solicitous service to everyone, their smiles strained but present. Regional Director Calvin Porter had taken up residence in the first-class cabin, making urgent phone calls and typing frantically on his tablet. Occasionally, he would glance back at Zoe, his expression a mixture of concern and calculation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the continued delay," came the captain's voice over the intercom. "We're working to resolve a staffing issue and should be departing shortly. We appreciate your patience." A collective groan rose from the passengers. A businessman checked his watch pointedly. A mother tried to soothe her increasingly restless children. "This is on them, not you," a woman called out to Zoe from across the aisle. "Don't let them make you feel bad about standing up for yourself." Zoe nodded appreciatively. She understood the dynamics at play, how quickly public support could turn if inconvenience lasted too long, how easily she could be cast as the villain disrupting everyone's travel plans rather than the victim addressing discrimination. Timothy Reed seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't worry about the delay backlash. Most people here saw what happened." "It's not my first rodeo," Zoe replied with a small smile. "Public opinion is predictable in these situations." As if on cue, Porter emerged from first class and approached her row. "Investigator Washington," he began, his voice calibrated to carry just far enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding today. We take these matters extremely seriously." "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Mr. Porter," Zoe corrected him, matching his volume precisely. "It was discriminatory treatment, documented by multiple witnesses and my official observation." Porter winced slightly. "Of course. That's why we've removed Ms. Bennett from this flight and will be conducting a full internal review of her conduct." "I'm afraid an internal review won't be sufficient," Zoe replied. "This incident is now part of an active DOJ investigation into systemic discrimination within your airline." A new voice joined the conversation. "Excuse me," said a black woman in her 60s, leaning across the aisle. "I've been flying this airline for decades, and I've experienced this kind of treatment countless times. No one ever did anything about it before." "Ma'am, we value all our customers," Porter began, but the woman cut him off. "Save it. I've heard those lines before. I want to give my contact information to the investigator here. I have plenty to share about my experiences." Porter's professional smile faltered. "Of course. We encourage all feedback." More passengers began to speak up. "They always randomly select me for additional bag checks," said a South Asian man in business class. "Last month, they made my son sit apart from me while leaving empty seats next to white families," added a Latina mother. "They lost my luggage 3 times in a year. None of my white colleagues had that problem," contributed a black executive. Zoe observed Porter's growing discomfort with clinical interest. This cascade of testimonials wasn't unusual in her experience. Once one person felt safe speaking up, others followed, revealing patterns that had previously remained beneath the surface of polite silence. "I'd be happy to take all your statements," Zoe announced to the cabin. "Once we're airborne, I'll move through the cabin with my official forms. Your experiences are valuable evidence." Porter cleared his throat. "Investigator Washington, perhaps we could offer you an upgrade to first class for your inconvenience today." Zoe fixed him with a level gaze. "Mr. Porter, are you attempting to provide preferential treatment to a federal investigator examining discrimination claims against your airline?" His face flushed. "No, I just thought, I'll remain in my assigned seat," Zoe interrupted. "Any special treatment now would compromise the integrity of my investigation." Timothy suppressed a smile beside her. Porter nodded stiffly. "Of course. We'll have you on your way shortly." He retreated toward the front of the plane, phone already back at his ear. 5 minutes later, a new flight attendant entered the aircraft. Barbara, according to her name tag, was an older black woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. She quickly organized the remaining crew, and preparations for departure resumed in earnest. As the plane finally pulled away from the gate, Zoe reflected on the training that had prepared her for moments like this. The DOJ's undercover operations were meticulously planned, with investigators selected based on specific demographic profiles needed for each case. Zoe had been through extensive preparation on how to document discrimination without revealing her identity prematurely. "I've never seen anything like that," Timothy said as the plane taxied toward the runway. "The way everything changed the moment you showed your badge." "Power recognizes power," Zoe replied. "It shouldn't take federal credentials to be treated with basic respect, but often that's the reality." "I'm a bit embarrassed," Timothy admitted. "I fly constantly for work, and I've probably been oblivious to this happening around me." "Most discrimination is designed to be invisible to everyone except its targets," Zoe explained. "That's what makes it so insidious and difficult to address." The plane accelerated down the runway, finally lifting into the night sky over Chicago. As they climbed through the clouds, the cabin settled into a tense calm. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstrations with exaggerated professionalism, making conspicuous eye contact with passengers of all races. Barbara approached their row once the seatbelt sign was turned off. "Ms. Washington, if you need anything at all during this flight, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you, Barbara. I will." Once Barbara moved on, Timothy leaned closer. "So what happens now?" "With the investigation, I mean." "Now," Zoe said, opening her laptop, "we document everything while it's fresh. I'll need your contact information if you're willing to provide a formal statement about what you witnessed." "Absolutely," Timothy nodded. "Whatever helps." As Zoe began typing her preliminary report, she noticed a young flight attendant hovering nearby, seeming to work up the courage to approach. Her name tag read, Maria Gonzalez. "Excuse me," Maria said quietly when she finally made her way to Zoe's row. "Could I speak with you privately when you have a moment?" The look in Maria's eyes was one Zoe had seen before, the cautious hope of someone who had information but feared the consequences of sharing it. "Of course," Zoe replied. "I'll find you once I've completed this section of my report." As Maria walked away, Zoe returned to her documentation, increasingly certain that this case was about to become much bigger than one flight attendant's behavior or even one airline's practices. The patterns emerging suggested an industry-wide issue requiring systemic intervention. The plane continued eastward through the night sky, carrying not just passengers but also the weight of accumulated injustices finally coming to light. At 30,000 feet above the American heartland, the dynamics aboard Flight 1372 had transformed dramatically. Zoe observed with professional detachment how differently she was now being treated by the cabin crew. The same flight attendants who had overlooked her earlier now approached regularly, offering beverages, snacks, and solicitous inquiries about her comfort. "The water they suddenly can't stop offering you," Timothy remarked with a wry smile. "It's almost like watching a nature documentary about behavior changes." "It's predictable," Zoe replied, typing notes on her laptop. "Once authority is established, treatment adapts accordingly. The problem is that equal treatment shouldn't require federal credentials. Have you ever noticed how differently people treat you when they discover something about your status or position?" Comment number 1 if you've experienced this kind of status treatment shift, or number 2 if you think people generally treat everyone the same regardless of perceived importance. Like and subscribe to see how deep this discrimination investigation goes. Using the plane's Wi-Fi, Zoe had already sent preliminary reports to her team at the DOJ. Her supervisor, Director Alvin Pearson, had responded immediately, authorizing her to expand the scope of the investigation based on the evidence she'd already collected. Zoe's mind drifted to previous cases she'd handled throughout her career with the Civil Rights Division. The housing discrimination case in Chicago she'd just completed had taken 3 years of meticulous evidence gathering and legal maneuvering before reaching resolution. A voter suppression case in Georgia had required 6 months of undercover work in local election offices. Each victory had been hard-fought, each settlement a small step toward systemic change. This transportation discrimination case was showing familiar patterns. Initial complaints had come from individual passengers, mostly people of color, who reported differential treatment across multiple flights and routes. Statistical analysis had revealed significant disparities in complaint resolution rates based on the complainant's race. Internal communications obtained through legal channels showed concerning language from management about certain demographic groups. But what had prompted the undercover operation was data showing that this particular airline had a complaint rate from passengers of color that was 3 times the industry average. Something systematic was happening, and today Zoe had experienced it firsthand. A soft chime from her laptop indicated a new message, additional information from her research team. They had compiled a spreadsheet of previous complaints against the airline, coded by race of complainant, nature of complaint, and resolution status. The patterns were stark and undeniable. "Ms. Washington?" A quiet voice interrupted her analysis. Maria Gonzalez, the young flight attendant who had requested to speak with her earlier, stood in the aisle, her posture tense. "Yes, Ms. Gonzalez. If you have a moment, I could show you something in the galley." Zoe saved her work and followed Maria to the rear galley, where they could speak with relative privacy behind the curtain. "I've been with the airline for 3 years," Maria began, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to you today?" "It happens all the time, and I've been documenting it." She glanced around nervously before pulling out her personal phone. "I could lose my job for this, but I can't stay silent anymore. I have screenshots of internal communications, training materials, and notes from crew briefings." Maria showed Zoe a folder of meticulously organized evidence. Memos about passenger profiling for security enhancement, crew evaluations that rewarded maintaining cabin culture, and most damning, a training slide showing different protocols for handling complaints based on passenger types. "They never explicitly mention race," Maria explained, "but the coding is obvious to anyone who works there. The photos they use in examples, the neighborhoods they list as requiring additional verification for credit card purchases." Zoe studied the material with growing concern. "Why are you showing me this now, Maria? You must have known about these practices for some time." Maria's eyes dampened. "My brother is a DACA recipient. Last month, he was removed from a flight on our airline because someone complained he was suspicious. He was just reading a book in Spanish." She took a shaky breath. "I was afraid to speak up before. I need this job. But seeing you today, standing up to Heather, showing your DOJ credentials, I realized I had to do something." "You're taking a significant risk," Zoe acknowledged. "Whistleblower protections exist, but retaliation can be subtle and difficult to prove." "I know," Maria nodded. "But I can't be part of this anymore. Would you be willing to provide an official statement and share these documents formally with my office?" "Yes," Maria said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." Zoe gave Maria her direct contact information and explained the process for protected disclosure. As they concluded their conversation, Zoe realized this case had just expanded significantly beyond one incident or even one airline. Maria's evidence suggested industry-wide practices that systematically disadvantaged passengers of color. Returning to her seat, Zoe found several passengers waiting to speak with her. Over the next hour, she discreetly collected statements from travelers who had witnessed today's events or had their own experiences to share. The South Asian businessman described being repeatedly selected for random additional screening despite his global entry status. The black executive detailed how his frequent flyer benefits seemed to disappear when he tried to use them. The Latina mother explained how her family was routinely seated apart despite booking together, while white families remained united. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a pattern of discrimination so normalized that many passengers had simply accepted it as an inevitable part of air travel for people of color. Timothy Reed had been observing the parade of testimonials with growing discomfort. "I fly at least twice a week," he admitted when Zoe returned to their row. "I've never noticed any of this. I mean, I've seen people upset about service, but I always assumed it was just random bad luck or entitled passengers." That's how privilege often works, Zoe explained without judgment. The absence of negative experiences isn't something we typically notice. I want to help, Timothy said firmly. Whatever statement or testimony you need from me, I'm willing to provide it. As Zoe continued gathering evidence, she noticed Barbara, the replacement head flight attendant, watching her work with a knowing expression. During a quiet moment, Barbara paused beside her seat. 27 years I've been flying, she said softly. Some things have changed. Many haven't. It's about time someone with authority started paying attention. By the time the captain announced their initial descent into Washington, D.C., Zoe had compiled enough preliminary evidence to justify a full-scale investigation. Her phone contained dozens of contacts for follow-up interviews, and her laptop held the beginnings of what could become a landmark transportation discrimination case. As the plane began its descent, Zoe noticed an alert on her phone. Social media was already buzzing with videos from the flight, #, #Justice Midair and #Federal ID Reveal. One clip had over 50,000 views and climbing. The public narrative was forming before they even touched the ground, and judging by the comments, public opinion was decidedly in her favor. But Zoe knew from experience that public support could be fickle, especially once powerful corporate interests began their damage control. Looking out the window at the twinkling lights of the capital city below, Zoe prepared herself for what would come next. The real battle was just beginning. What would you do if you discovered your company had discriminatory policies? Would you risk your job to expose them like Maria, or would you stay silent to protect your livelihood? This flight attendant made her choice, but the consequences are just beginning to unfold. The videos had gone viral by the time Zoe's plane touched down at Reagan National Airport. As passengers deplaned, many were already watching clips of the confrontation on their phones, the moment of revelation when she displayed her DOJ credentials replayed in endless loops across social media platforms. Calvin Porter, the airline's regional director, waited anxiously at the gate, flanked by two men in expensive suits whom Zoe immediately identified as corporate attorneys by their body language and the leather portfolios clutched in their hands. "Investigator Washington," Porter called as she emerged from the jetway. "If we could have a moment of your time." Zoe approached them calmly, aware of passengers watching the interaction. "Mr. Porter, I'll be issuing formal requests for information through proper channels. Any communication should go through the Department of Justice." The taller attorney stepped forward. "James Whitfield, Chief Legal Officer for the airline. We'd like to discuss what happened today and address any concerns you might have." "My concerns are now part of an active federal investigation," Zoe replied. "I suggest you prepare for forthcoming subpoenas rather than attempting to manage me in an airport terminal." "We believe there have been some misunderstandings," Whitfield persisted. "The airline has a robust non-discrimination policy, and what you experienced today was an isolated incident involving one employee who has already been suspended pending review." "Interesting approach," Zoe observed. "Sacrificing an individual employee to protect systemic practices." "My investigation suggests the issue runs considerably deeper than one flight attendant." The second attorney cleared his throat. "We'd like to resolve this matter quickly and amicably. The airline is prepared to offer accommodations that reflect our commitment to addressing your concerns. Are you attempting to settle a federal civil rights investigation with airline vouchers, Mr. Richardson?" "Thomas Richardson, Deputy General Counsel." "Mr. Richardson, attempting to influence a federal investigation could be construed as obstruction of justice. I suggest you reconsider your approach." As they spoke, Zoe noticed Timothy Reed watching from a discreet distance, clearly waiting to ensure she wasn't being intimidated. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod of support. "We're not attempting to influence anything," Porter interjected, his voice tight. "We're simply trying to address a customer service issue before it escalates unnecessarily." This ceased being a customer service issue the moment your employee engaged in discriminatory practices, Zoe stated firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a report to file." As she turned to leave, Whitfield called after her. You should know that our security footage from the aircraft doesn't support your characterization of events. Technical issues seem to have affected certain camera angles. The implication was clear: evidence was already being managed, possibly destroyed. Tampering with evidence in a federal investigation carries significant penalties, Mr. Whitfield, Zoe replied without turning back. Something to consider before your technical issues become too widespread. She continued through the terminal, aware of eyes following her progress. Outside, she hailed a rideshare to take her directly to the DOJ offices rather than home. This case wouldn't wait until morning. As her car pulled away from the curb, her phone rang. Director Pearson. Washington, she answered. You've caused quite a stir, Pearson said, his voice a mixture of concern and approval. Videos from that flight are everywhere. The airline's PR team is in full damage control mode. I followed protocols, sir. The discrimination was blatant and consistent with the pattern we've been tracking. I'm not questioning your judgment, Zoe. But the airline's CEO has already called the Attorney General. They're claiming entrapment and saying you provoked the incident. Of course they are, Zoe replied, unsurprised. Standard playbook: discredit the victim, minimize the incident, claim it's an isolated case. They're also suggesting you may have been overly aggressive in your approach. There it was, the familiar accusation leveled at black women who stood their ground. Too aggressive. Too emotional. Too loud. Never just right. The videos show otherwise, Zoe responded calmly. As do multiple witness statements I've already collected. I know, Pearson assured her. I'm just preparing you. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. The airline has significant political connections and a substantial lobbying presence. They won't go down without a fight. Neither will I, Zoe stated simply. When she arrived at the DOJ building, a team was already assembled in the conference room, ready to process the evidence she'd collected. The case had been escalated to priority status based on the social media attention and the airline's immediate pushback. As she briefed her colleagues, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: footage from all flights mysteriously under review. Server maintenance scheduled tonight. Move quickly. Maria Gonzalez was clearly still taking risks to help the investigation. By midnight, the first signs of a coordinated resistance were emerging. Conservative media outlets were running stories questioning the appropriateness of undercover federal agents on commercial flights. The airline had issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern about mischaracterizations of their service while reaffirming their commitment to diversity. And most telling, Zoe's inbox contained an email from the airline's legal team, offering a 7-figure settlement for any misunderstanding that may have occurred, contingent on a non-disclosure agreement and immediate cessation of the investigation. They're scared, noted Pearson when she forwarded him the email. They wouldn't offer that kind of money for an isolated incident. The next morning brought new challenges. Security footage from the aircraft had indeed been corrupted during routine server maintenance. Heather Bennett had been placed on administrative leave but was now giving interviews claiming she had been set up by a government agent with an agenda. More concerning, Zoe's personal phone began receiving messages from blocked numbers, some merely unpleasant, others explicitly threatening. Back off or regret it, read one. Some people should know their place, stated another. When she arrived at her office, Director Pearson was waiting with a concerned expression. The Deputy AG wants to speak with us, he said gravely. There are questions about whether proper protocols were followed. All protocols were followed, Zoe assured him. I identified myself only after discrimination occurred and escalation was imminent. Everything is documented in my preliminary report. I know, Pearson nodded. But the airline has friends in high places. They're suggesting your investigation was targeted harassment, not legitimate oversight. Throughout her career, Zoe had faced this moment many times, the point where institutional power circled wagons to protect itself, where doing the right thing became professionally risky. It was the moment that separated those who fought for justice from those who settled for the appearance of it. "There's more," Pearson continued. "We've learned that Heather Bennett has a history of similar complaints that were settled quietly. The airline protected her repeatedly because her father sits on their board of directors. So it wasn't just racial bias," Zoe realized. "It was protected racial bias." "Exactly. Which makes this even more significant, and more dangerous for your career if we push forward." As they prepared to meet with leadership, Zoe received another text, this time from Timothy Reed. "Being pressured by my company to retract my statement. Our firm has a major contract with the airline. What should I do?" The walls were closing in from all sides, evidence disappearing, witnesses being intimidated, political pressure mounting, and her own professional standing now at risk. That evening, as Zoe worked late at her desk, her office phone rang. "Is this Investigator Washington?" asked a male voice she didn't recognize. "Speaking. This is Frank Dawson, Senior Vice President at Carlton Financial. We're the airline's primary investment partner." Zoe said nothing, waiting. "I'll be direct," Dawson continued. "This situation has the potential to damage a lot of portfolios. The airline employs thousands of people. Stock prices are already responding to these allegations." "Facts, Mr. Dawson. Not allegations. Whatever you want to call them," he dismissed. "Here's what I'm authorized to offer. $8 million to a racial justice organization of your choice. A comprehensive review of the airline's training protocols. And a senior advisory position for you on their newly formed Diversity Council, with appropriate compensation. In exchange for classifying this as an individual employee issue rather than a systemic problem. Settling privately rather than pursuing public action. You're asking me to bury evidence of widespread discrimination for money and a title. I'm offering you a chance to create real change from within, rather than a destructive confrontation that could cost thousands of jobs." It was the most dangerous moment in any justice work, when wrong masqueraded as pragmatism, when compromise was framed as wisdom. Zoe had seen countless righteous cases derailed by such offers. "Thank you for your call, Mr. Dawson," Zoe replied evenly. "I'll be referring this conversation to our ethics division as an attempted inducement to obstruct justice." She hung up, knowing she had just made powerful enemies but feeling a clarity that only comes from refusing to be bought. Her phone lit up with a text from Maria Gonzalez, "They fired me today. Unauthorized access to company materials. Worth it though. Keep fighting." The battle lines were now clearly drawn. On one side, an airline with wealth, political connections, and institutional power. On the other, a black woman with a badge, the truth, and a growing coalition of the mistreated and overlooked. Zoe opened her laptop and began typing a comprehensive memo to the Attorney General, laying out everything she had discovered and the pressure being applied to conceal it. If her career was going to be sacrificed, it would be in service of truth, not in surrender to power. As she worked into the night, she remembered her father's words years ago, "The system only changes when someone brave enough to work within it refuses to play by its corrupted rules." That someone, tonight, was her. The morning news cycles were dominated by the airline controversy. Video clips from the flight played on repeat across networks, with commentators dissecting every word and gesture. Zoe's face appeared on screens nationwide, her professional headshot from the DOJ website juxtaposed with blurry stills from passenger recordings. Public opinion had splintered predictably along familiar lines. Some praised her as a courageous whistleblower exposing everyday discrimination. Others questioned her motives, suggesting she had deliberately provoked the situation to advance her career or a political agenda. "Undercover feds on your flight," screamed one headline. "Brave DOJ investigator exposes airline racism," declared another. Zoe ignored the media circus, focusing instead on methodically building her case. She had worked through the night with her team, compiling witness statements, analyzing Maria Gonzalez's evidence, and documenting the pressure tactics being deployed against her investigation. Director Pearson entered her office without knocking, his expression grave. "The Deputy AG wants to see us. Now." In the Deputy Attorney General's expansive office, Zoe immediately sensed the tension. Deputy AG Victoria Ellis sat behind her desk, flanked by two senior officials Zoe didn't recognize. "Investigator Washington," Ellis began without preamble. "You've created quite a situation." "The airline created the situation, ma'am," Zoe replied calmly. "I merely documented it." Ellis's expression remained neutral. "The protocol for undercover operations requires prior approval from the Operations Committee. Your supervisor approved this independently." "Time-sensitive circumstances," Director Pearson interjected. "We had received credible information about ongoing discrimination that required immediate verification." "Regardless," Ellis continued, "the airline is claiming entrapment and selective enforcement. They've filed a formal complaint about your conduct." One of the unknown officials slid a folder across the desk. "The airline has compiled what they call a pattern of aggressive enforcement in your previous cases. They're suggesting a personal vendetta against transportation companies." Zoe opened the folder to find details of her past investigations: housing discrimination in Chicago, voter suppression in Georgia, hiring discrimination in Texas, all reframed as evidence of her being combative and agenda-driven. "They're attacking my record of successfully prosecuting civil rights violations," Zoe observed. "That's my job." "The concern," Ellis explained carefully, "is whether your approach in this case may have compromised our ability to secure a legally sound outcome." The implication was clear: Zoe was being set up as the scapegoat. If she had violated protocols, the entire case could be dismissed as fruit of a poison tree, regardless of the evidence collected. "With respect, ma'am," Zoe responded, "I followed all procedural guidelines. I did not identify myself as a federal agent until after discrimination had occurred and been documented. My presence on that flight was part of a pattern analysis based on statistical evidence of disparate treatment." Ellis studied her for a long moment. "The airline has offered a substantial settlement and comprehensive internal review. They're willing to implement new training protocols and create a diversity oversight committee. In exchange for burying the systemic nature of the discrimination and blaming it all on one employee," Zoe concluded. "It would be a significant victory without the uncertainty of prolonged litigation," Ellis countered. "Sometimes pragmatism serves justice better than principle." Zoe had heard this argument throughout her career: the practical compromise, the achievable victory, the bird in hand. It was how systems perpetuated themselves, offering just enough reform to avoid fundamental change. "The evidence suggests this isn't isolated to one airline," Zoe stated firmly. "Maria Gonzalez's documentation shows industry-wide practices that systematically disadvantage passengers of color. Accepting this settlement would abandon all those affected by these broader practices." The tension in the room thickened. This was the breaking point, the moment where institutional inertia collided with moral clarity. "There's something else you should know," Pearson interjected. "Ms. Gonzalez was terminated this morning. The official reason was unauthorized access to company materials, but the timing suggests retaliation for whistleblowing." "Which is illegal," Zoe added. "Proving retaliation is notoriously difficult," Ellis sighed. "We have the timeline and documentation," Zoe countered. "And her termination only strengthens our case about the airline's practices." As they debated, Zoe's phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was from Timothy Reed, with a single line: "They're trying to destroy your credibility. Check social media." Excusing herself briefly, Zoe stepped into the hallway and opened Twitter to find #ZoeWashingtonExposed trending. The airline had launched a coordinated social media campaign questioning her professionalism and impartiality. Selected quotes from her academic papers on systemic racism were being shared out of context. Photos of her attending civil rights rallies during law school were circulating with captions suggesting she was an activist, not an objective investigator. A college classmate had given an interview claiming Zoe had always been looking for racism where it didn't exist. Someone had even dug up a decade-old tweet where she had criticized the airline industry's environmental practices. The attack was comprehensive and clearly professional, the work of a high-priced crisis management firm attempting to transform her from whistleblower to witch hunter in the public imagination. Returning to the meeting, Zoe found Ellis on the phone, her expression darkening as she listened. "I understand." "Yes, sir. We're addressing it now." She hung up and fixed Zoe with a penetrating stare. That was the Attorney General. The airline's CEO has the ear of several senators on the Judiciary Committee. There's significant pressure to resolve this quietly. Political pressure shouldn't determine how we enforce civil rights laws, Zoe responded. In an ideal world, perhaps, Ellis conceded. But we operate in the real world, with real constraints. The moment reminded Zoe of a conversation with her father years ago, when she had declared her intention to become a civil rights attorney. The hardest thing, he had warned, won't be fighting the obvious villains. It will be standing firm when those on your own side suggest compromising with injustice for practical reasons. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Maria Gonzalez, more whistleblowers coming forward. Flight attendants from 3 other airlines with similar stories. This is bigger than we thought. Simultaneously, an email arrived from a journalist at the Washington Post requesting comment on a developing story about the airline's internal training practices, with documents showing explicit instructions for different treatment based on passenger profiles. The pieces were coming together, creating a momentum that even political pressure might not be able to contain. "I have a choice to make," Zoe said finally, looking directly at Ellis. "I can accept a settlement that creates the appearance of justice while preserving the underlying system of discrimination. Or I can follow this investigation wherever it leads, regardless of the powerful interests involved." Ellis's expression softened slightly. "Your integrity isn't in question, Investigator Washington. But there are practical realities to consider. This could become a years-long battle with uncertain outcomes. The airline has resources to fight this indefinitely." "So do we," Zoe replied simply. "That's why the Civil Rights Division exists." As she spoke, her phone lit up with a notification. Someone had leaked the airline's internal diversity statistics to the media, showing dramatic disparities in hiring, promotion, and disciplinary actions across racial lines. The story was spreading rapidly. "It appears events are outpacing our discussion," Pearson observed, glancing at his own phone. Multiple news outlets are now reporting on a culture of discrimination within the airline. Ellis sighed deeply. The political calculus is shifting by the minute. "This was never about politics," Zoe stated firmly. "It's about equal protection under the law, the fundamental promise our department exists to uphold." A knock at the door interrupted them. An aide entered with an urgent message. The Congressional Black Caucus had called a press conference to address the airline discrimination allegations and was requesting Zoe's presence. The power dynamics were shifting rapidly. What had begun as one incident on one flight was expanding into a national conversation about discrimination in transportation, exactly the systemic reckoning Zoe had sought. Ellis closed the folder on her desk. "It seems we're past the point of quiet resolution. Investigator Washington, proceed with your investigation as planned. Director Pearson, ensure all protocols are meticulously followed from this point forward. We can't afford any procedural vulnerabilities." As Zoe left the building to attend the congressional press conference, she received one final text, from Timothy Reed, "Just resigned from my position rather than retract my statement. Some things matter more than a paycheck. Let me know how I can help." The breaking point had passed. What had seemed like an isolated incident just days ago had cracked open a much larger truth that could no longer be contained. The question was no longer whether justice would be pursued, but how far-reaching that justice would be. As cameras flashed and microphones clustered before her at the Capitol, Zoe took a deep breath and prepared to bring the full weight of her office, and her personal courage, to bear on a system that had remained unchallenged for too long. 6 months after that fateful flight, Zoe Washington sat in the gallery of the House Transportation Committee, watching as the airline's CEO, Richard Blackwell, shifted uncomfortably under the intense questioning of congressional representatives. "So to be clear, Mr. Blackwell," Congresswoman Eleanor Chen pressed, "your company's internal documents specifically instructed flight attendants to apply different standards of service based on passenger profiles that closely aligned with racial characteristics. Those materials were unauthorized and not reflective of our corporate policies," Blackwell insisted, his forehead glistening under the bright lights. "Yet they were used in official training sessions for over 5 years, Chen countered, holding up the evidence Zoe's team had meticulously compiled. And employees who questioned these practices were systematically sidelined or terminated. In the months following the viral incident, Zoe's investigation had expanded dramatically. What began as one confrontation on one flight had uncovered industry-wide practices of discrimination that affected millions of travelers annually. The journey to this moment had not been easy. The airline had initially fought back with everything in its considerable arsenal: legal challenges, media manipulation, political pressure. But as more employees came forward with evidence and more passengers shared their experiences, the dam of silence had broken. Maria Gonzalez had become the face of airline whistleblowers, testifying courageously despite the personal and professional risks. Timothy Reed had founded an organization called Allies for Equal Travel, mobilizing frequent flyers to document and report discriminatory treatment. Most significantly, the Department of Justice had expanded its investigation to include all major carriers, revealing similar patterns across the industry. What Zoe had experienced wasn't an isolated incident but a glimpse into standard operating procedures designed to provide preferential treatment to certain passengers at the expense of others. The Department of Justice investigation has resulted in the largest civil rights settlement in transportation history, announced Attorney General Lawrence Thompson at a press conference following the hearing. The airline has agreed to pay $200 million in penalties and implement comprehensive reforms under federal monitoring. Standing beside Thompson, Zoe felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication, certainly, but also a solemn recognition of how much work remained. Monetary penalties and policy changes were important first steps, but transforming deeply embedded cultural practices would require sustained effort and vigilance. Under the terms of the settlement, the airline would implement mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, establish an independent oversight committee with actual enforcement powers, and create transparent reporting mechanisms for passengers experiencing unequal treatment. Most importantly, the settlement created new industry-wide regulations requiring all airlines to collect and publish data on passenger complaints categorized by race, gender, and other protected characteristics, creating accountability through transparency. Heather Bennett, the flight attendant whose discriminatory actions had triggered the investigation, had issued a public apology after undergoing extensive sensitivity training. "I never saw myself as biased," she admitted in a widely viewed interview. "But this experience forced me to confront assumptions I didn't even realize I was making." Maria Gonzalez had been reinstated with back pay and protections, now serving as the chair of the airline's newly formed Employee Diversity Council with authority to review and revise training materials and practices. As Zoe left the Capitol, reporters clustered around her. "Investigator Washington, how does it feel to have transformed an entire industry through one encounter?" Zoe considered her response carefully. This wasn't about one encounter or one person. It was about recognizing that moment as part of a pattern that affected countless travelers every day. "The credit belongs to everyone who had the courage to speak up: Maria Gonzalez, Timothy Reed, and all the passengers and employees who shared their experiences despite the risks." Later that evening, in the privacy of her apartment, Zoe called her father. "I saw you on the news," he said, his voice warm with pride. "My daughter, changing the world one flight at a time." "I just did my job, Dad," Zoe replied modestly. "No," he corrected her. You did what I always taught you, you used the system to fix the system. You remembered that having power means nothing if you don't use it for those who don't. As they talked, Zoe's email pinged with a notification. She had been appointed to lead the Department of Justice's new Transportation Civil Rights Division, created specifically to address discrimination across all modes of public transit. The position represented not just a professional advancement but an opportunity to institutionalize the changes she had fought for. 3 weeks later, Zoe found herself boarding another flight, this time to visit her parents in Baltimore. As she settled into her seat, she observed the cabin crew, noticeably more diverse than industry standards, treating all passengers with equal attention and respect. The head flight attendant, an older black woman with warm eyes, moved efficiently through the cabin, ensuring everyone's needs were met without distinction. When she reached Zoe's row, she paused momentarily, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "My daughter flies frequently for college. The difference in how she's treated now compared to before, it matters." Zoe nodded, understanding the profound significance of that simple acknowledgement. In the grand scheme of justice, equal treatment on an airplane might seem small compared to housing discrimination or voting rights. Yet dignity in daily life, the right to move through the world without being diminished by 1,000 small inequities, formed the foundation of true equality. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a 10-year-old girl promising her wrongfully arrested father that she would fix this, to a DOJ investigator with the authority to create systemic change, her path had never been easy, but it had always been clear. The aircraft lifted into the sky, carrying passengers of all backgrounds, each now more likely to receive the equal treatment the law had always promised but the system had often denied. It wasn't perfect, no single case could dismantle centuries of ingrained bias, but it was progress. Real, measurable progress. Zoe opened her laptop to begin drafting guidelines for the new division, remembering her father's words, "Justice isn't a destination we reach once and celebrate. It's a path we must walk every day, with vigilance and courage." Today, that path stretched before her, challenging but clearer than it had been 6 months ago. Because of one flight, one moment of standing firm, and the courage of many who followed, countless travelers would move through the world with a little more dignity, a little more equality, a little more justice. And that, Zoe Washington knew, was worth every struggle along the way. This powerful story reminds us that systemic discrimination often thrives because good people stay silent. Zoe's courage demonstrates how one person in the right position can create lasting change when they refuse to accept injustice. The airline's attempts to dismiss discrimination as an isolated incident reflects how institutions typically respond, by individualizing systemic problems to avoid accountability. We also see how privilege operates invisibly. Timothy never noticed the discrimination happening around him until witnessing it directly. His choice to ultimately sacrifice personal comfort for justice shows that allyship requires more than just words. Maria's whistleblowing reminds us that internal change often requires brave insiders willing to risk their livelihoods. The initial public support that wavered when inconvenience arose shows how fragile solidarity can be when it requires personal sacrifice. Perhaps most importantly, this story illustrates why representation matters in positions of power. Had Zoe been just another passenger without federal credentials, her complaint would likely have joined thousands of others filed away and forgotten. Sometimes justice requires not just courage, but the authority to make courage effective. What discrimination have you witnessed in everyday situations? Would you have spoken up like Timothy or stayed silent? Comment below with your experiences. If this story about fighting racism moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to see more powerful racism stories that need to be told. Share this video with someone who needs this message of courage and accountability. Thank you for watching, and remember, in the face of discrimination, silence is never neutrality, it's complicity. See you in the next powerful true story.